You hear the whistle of the wind through your helmet. Your armor is cracked, your blade dull and stained. The banners of your clan flutter one last time in the rising sun, and for the first time in centuries, the samurai are no longer feared. Not by enemies, not by peasants, not even by the emperor, because this isn't the glory days of feudal Japan. This is the end, and you're not a noble warrior anymore. You're a relic. Today we're diving into the slow, brutal, and eerily silent death of the samurai. Not with a bang, but with paperwork, taxes, and a gunshot from the west. You think the katana died with honor? Think again. Let's be honest. When you hear the word samurai, your brain probably flashes to something like this. A lone warrior, face hidden behind a menacing mask, wind blowing through sakura blossoms. He draws his katana with a whisper, one stroke, one kill, absolute discipline, absolute honor. Cool. Now throw all that out, because the real samurai, they were complicated, messy, human, and very often not honorable at all. Sure, they had a code, Bushido, the way of the warrior. But here's the thing no one tells you. That code, it wasn't even widely written down until the 1600s, long after the most brutal samurai battles had already been fought. And most of the time, Bushido wasn't about moral virtue. It was about control. How do you keep thousands of armed men from killing each other during peacetime? Give them a code, give them poetry, give them discipline, make them believe in a higher cause so they don't start carving up the local market over spilled sake. And it worked, sometimes. But more often, samurai were political pawns. They pledged loyalty to one lord and switched sides when it suited them. They assassinated rivals in the dead of night. They collected taxes from starving farmers, and if those farmers couldn't pay, they burned their homes to the ground. Let's be real. They weren't monks with swords. They were enforcers, aristocrats with a license to kill. And yet, they had style, the armor, the discipline, the mythology. And that's what stuck. Because while knights in Europe were dying off in bloody religious wars, the samurai marketed themselves. Through art, through stories, through culture. They became symbols of Japan's identity, not because of how they lived, but because of how they were remembered. The irony, the very image that made them immortal, was created long after most of them were gone. In the end, the samurai weren't gods. They were men. And just like any class of power, their downfall wasn't a question of if, but when. Here's a paradox for you. The samurai spent centuries fighting for peace, and when they finally got it, it killed them. Let's rewind to the 1500s. Japan was chaos incarnate, a time known as the Sengoku Jidai, or the Warring States period. Think of it like Game of Thrones, but everyone's armed with katanas and spears, and no one's ever heard of indoor plumbing. Over 100 feudal lords, daimyo, fighting nonstop for land, power, and legacy. It was brutal, bloody, and honestly, the samurai thrived in it. This was their purpose: war, honor through combat, status through violence. Entire generations were born and died on the battlefield, but all wars eventually produce a victor. And in Japan's case, that victor was the Tokugawa clan. In 1600, Tokugawa Ieyasu crushed his enemies at the Battle of Sekigahara and became Shogun, the military ruler of all Japan. This wasn't just a political win. This was a reset button on Japanese society. And so began the Tokugawa shogunate, also known as the Edo period, a time of structure, stability, and order. No more mass wars. No more ambitious daimyo with private armies. Just peace. Too much peace. At first, the samurai adapted. They were still at the top of the food chain. Still feared. Still respected. But peace is a funny thing. It erodes usefulness. What do you do with a warrior class when there are no wars left to fight? You domesticate them. The Tokugawa regime transformed samurai into a bureaucratic elite. They became administrators, tax collectors, judges, teachers, scribes. Sounds noble, right? Except, most of them weren't trained for this. They had spent their lives learning to kill, not keep records. Their swords dulled, both literally and figuratively. Many were forced to move into the cities, living on government stipends. They were forbidden from farming or engaging in trade. Those were beneath them, so they waited. and wrote poems, and practiced sword forms for battles that would never come. Over time, the samurai became ceremonial. Their armor, once functional, became decorative. Their swords, symbols, not weapons. And their relevance, a ghost. You could feel it in the streets of Edo. Men who had trained their whole lives to fight. Now, debating rice taxes and zoning laws, they had become their own worst fear. Ineffective. It's like training to be a lion, and then being told your job is to alphabetize scrolls for a living. And under that heavy silence of peace, a slow, quiet death began. Not from arrows, not from betrayal, but from boredom, bureaucracy, and a role that no longer fit the times. Now, just because the samurai weren't actively dying on the battlefield doesn't mean they were safe. Far from it. The peace of the Edo period was rigid, not stable, stagnant. Imagine a society frozen in time. 4 social classes stacked like a stone tower. Samurai at the top, farmers below them, artisans beneath that, and merchants, the moneymakers, scraping the bottom. But here's the twist. The merchants, the so-called lowest class, were quietly getting rich. They traded, they saved, they invested, they played the long game. Meanwhile, many samurai were bleeding money. You see, samurai weren't allowed to earn money the common way. That would be dishonorable. So instead, they relied on stipends, government handouts based on outdated land taxes. But inflation hit. The economy changed, and those stipends, worth less every year. By the 1700s, thousands of samurai were effectively broke, pawning their swords, taking out loans from the merchants they once despised. Some even became ronin, masterless, drifting samurai, disgraced and desperate. The once feared warrior class now haunted the backstreets of Edo like relics, proud, armed, and unemployed. And underneath all of this was a rising tension. A class of men raised to fight and obey, now trapped in a cage of protocol and poverty. Something had to break, and eventually, it did. Enter the Americans. In 1853, Japan's 250-year-long policy of isolation, called Sakoku, came to a screeching halt. Why? Because a U.S. Navy fleet, led by Commodore Matthew Perry, sailed into Edo Bay with massive, smoke-belching warships, the infamous Black Ships, and a letter from President Millard Fillmore. The message? Open your ports, or we'll open fire. Japan had no navy that could compete. Their cannons were antiques. Their soldiers, mostly samurai, were trained for close-quarter combat, not naval warfare. The Tokugawa shogunate blinked. They signed the Treaty of Kanagawa. Trade opened. Foreigners flooded in. And suddenly, the myth of Japanese invincibility shattered overnight. The samurai, guardians of tradition, watched helplessly as Western suits strutted through their cities, backed by modern weapons and strange ideas like capitalism and parliament. Japan was no longer an island fortress. It was a chessboard, and the West had just moved first. And the samurai? They were obsolete. Musket versus katana, steamships versus honor, diplomacy versus ritual suicide. It wasn't a fight. It was a landslide. And as Japan scrambled to modernize, a new power began to rise. A force that would finally pull the plug on the samurai legacy for good. In 1868, a political earthquake shook Japan, the Meiji Restoration. After centuries of samurai rule under the Tokugawa shogunate, a group of young imperial loyalists, backed by powerful clans from the south, overthrew the old order. They didn't just want new rulers, they wanted a new Japan. The emperor, once a puppet behind palace walls, was restored to power, at least on paper. But behind him stood modernizers with a vision, industrial strength, Western science, and no more feudal chains. It was fast, bloody, relentless, a cultural revolution disguised as a polite coup. That was the Meiji Restoration, and nothing, not even the samurai, would survive it unchanged. The shogunate was abolished. The emperor, once a figurehead, was restored to actual power, but not really. The emperor was still mostly symbolic. The real movers were the young, reform-minded bureaucrats behind him, many of them ex-samurai themselves. They saw the writing on the wall. If Japan didn't modernize fast, it would end up carved into Western colonies like a Thanksgiving turkey. So they got to work. The Meiji government launched a brutal top-down reformation. A national conscript army replaced the samurai. Class privileges were wiped out. Samurai could no longer wear swords in public. Land was restructured, taxes revised, the samurai stipends gone. In the span of a decade, centuries of warrior culture were erased with a stroke of a pen. Imagine spending your whole life learning to bow, duel, recite poetry, and die with honor, only to be told your place in society is now illegal. Some samurai accepted it, others didn't. Enter the Satsuma Rebellion. In 1877, led by Saigo Takamori, one of the last true samurai, 20,000 rebels marched against the imperial army. They believed they were defending Japan's soul, its history, its honor. The imperial army crushed them with rifles, cannons, and modern discipline. It was a slaughter. Saigo, wounded, performed seppuku, ritual suicide, the final bloody punctuation mark at the end of the samurai era. It wasn't just the death of a rebellion, it was the execution of an identity. Here's the strange truth. The samurai didn't die. Not really. They were erased from society, yes. Their swords outlawed, their titles stripped, their way of life dissolved under the flood of modernity, but something survived. What do you do with a warrior class whose entire existence has been outlawed? If you're the Meiji government, you mythologize them. You repurpose the very thing you dismantled. The samurai, once real men of blood and discipline, became national symbols. Honorable, stoic, unflinching in the face of death. Perfect icons for a country trying to find its soul in a sea of Western influence. Books like Hagakure and Bushido. The soul of Japan didn't just preserve the samurai image. They rewrote it. Bushido became less a code and more a brand. And in the decades that followed, Japan's military and political leaders leaned hard into that image. By the early 20th century, samurai virtues were fused into nationalism. Their values echoed in schools, parades, and eventually battlefields. Even kamikaze pilots were seen as modern-day samurai, loyal unto death. But the samurai who had once defended rice fields and provincial lords, they were long gone. Their memory had been cleaned up, trimmed of mess and contradiction, and reassembled into something useful, a ghost. Today, the samurai live on, in cinema, in philosophy, in fashion and tattoos, in quiet temple courtyards and crowded Shibuya streets. They're no longer warriors, they're icons. And in a way, that might be the most enduring victory they ever achieved. So, what really killed the samurai? Not a sword, not a war, not even the government that outlawed them. What killed the samurai was time, that slow, unstoppable current that drowns even the fiercest traditions. But the death was never clean. It wasn't a battlefield blaze of glory, it was a slow unraveling, a cultural seppuku that took decades. And yet, in that death, came a strange kind of rebirth. Stripped of land, power, and purpose, the samurai were transformed into something else. An idea, a haunting memory, a symbol. They became the soul of a modern nation that no longer needed swords, but desperately needed identity. Today, you can still feel them, in the quiet reverence of martial arts, in the discipline of craftsmen who forge steel like it's sacred, in the eyes of an actor portraying a ronin on screen, all rage and silence and buried honor. The samurai no longer ride. They don't draw blades. They don't die in duels under falling cherry blossoms. But their shadow walks quietly behind every myth Japan tells about itself. Not warriors anymore. And if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the echo of their steel.